Don't sign that will. A small voice whispered so softly it barely cut through the polished silence of the Carter estate. And in that instant, everything in the room seemed to hesitate between motion and stillness, as if even the air had recognized something it could not ignore. William Carter, a 48-year-old billionaire known across New York's financial circles for building empires from numbers and instincts, paused with a pen hovering just above a stack of legal documents spread across the long mahogany table, sunlight pouring through the glass walls behind him like a calm ocean that suddenly forgot how to move. The room was supposed to be secure, controlled, predictable, filled with lawyers, assistants, and the kind of quiet confidence that money usually buys. Yet that whisper came from somewhere it should not have been coming from. Aaliyah Johnson, an 8-year-old black girl with braided hair and cautious eyes, stood half-hidden near the doorway leading to the corridor, her small hands gripping the strap of a worn backpack, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored in that moment. No one spoke for a second, not because they didn't hear her, but because they did and couldn't decide how to categorize it: a mistake, a joke, or something worse. Then a soft laugh broke the tension, followed by a dismissive shift of papers, as one of the attorneys leaned back in his chair and said lightly that children sometimes repeat things they hear without understanding them, trying to smooth the moment back into order. Another voice, more polished, added that estate matters were strictly confidential and that Aaliyah should not be in the room during this discussion, while the fiancée of William Carter, Evelyn Harper, placed a gentle hand on William's arm with a calm smile that looked perfectly constructed for situations like this. She was elegant, composed, and exactly the kind of presence that made people trust appearances before facts. "It's all right," she said softly, her tone wrapping around the room like silk over steel. "She's just overwhelmed. This is a big house, big conversations, children imagine things." But Aaliyah did not move, and her eyes did not drift, the way children's eyes usually do when adults start talking over them. Instead, she looked directly at William as if she had already seen something none of them had. William finally lowered the pen, not because he believed her, but because something in her voice did not belong to imagination. It belonged to certainty, the kind of certainty that does not ask permission to exist. "What did you say?" he asked slowly, his voice controlled but no longer indifferent. Aaliyah swallowed once, then repeated it, a little firmer this time. "Don't sign the original will, she stole it." The word stole did not belong in that room. It did not belong in conversations between billion-dollar assets and legal inheritance structures, and yet it landed there like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples no one could immediately smooth away. Evelyn gave a soft, almost sympathetic laugh, stepping slightly closer to William, as if protecting him from misunderstanding, saying the child must have heard something wrong. That wills were stored securely and handled by trusted legal teams, not something that could be simply stolen. The lawyers nodded in agreement, shifting uneasily but reinforcing each other with professional language about procedures and safeguards. Yet William's gaze did not move from Aaliyah. There was something unsettling in how she stood, not pleading, not begging to be believed, just waiting, as if the truth did not depend on permission. Then a subtle sound changed everything. The faint vibration of William's phone on the table, a notification from the estate security system showing a brief unauthorized access attempt to a restricted file labeled Original Last Will and Testament, logged just minutes earlier. William's eyes flickered downward for the first time, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as the calm architecture of the room began to feel less certain, less absolute. Evelyn noticed the shift and quickly placed her hand over the phone, suggesting calmly that technical systems often produced false alerts during document transfers, but William did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly looked back at Aaliyah. The room seemed to shrink around that exchange, not in volume, but in significance, as if every person present had suddenly realized they were no longer observing a routine legal process, but standing at the edge of something they could not yet define. Aaliyah took a small step forward, her voice quieter now, but sharper in meaning. "I saw her go into the study when no one was there, and she didn't come out the same way." No one asked how an 8-year-old could know what she claimed to know, because the question itself felt dangerous, like it might lead somewhere they were not ready to go. William finally set the pen down completely, the sound of it touching would echoing more loudly than it should have in the silence that followed. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, taxis moving, people walking, life pretending everything inside buildings like this was always under control. But inside the Carter estate something had already begun to shift, quietly, irreversibly, as if a door that had been locked for years had just been noticed as slightly open. I did not continue from a place of comfort in the room, because comfort was no longer available. The silence that followed Aaliyah Johnson's words was not empty. It was crowded, filled with competing thoughts that no one was willing to speak aloud. William Carter remained standing beside the long table, his hand no longer touching the pen, his attention divided between the child near the doorway and the subtle notification still glowing faintly on his phone screen. Evelyn Harper was the first to move, closing the distance with calm, deliberate steps, her heels soft against the polished floor as she gently tilted her head toward Aaliyah with a practiced expression of concern that suggested care without accepting possibility. She spoke in a soft voice meant to restore order, explaining that estate matters were highly structured, that no one could simply steal official documents without layers of verification, and that misunderstandings at a child's age were normal when overhearing adult conversations. Her words were smooth, carefully arranged, and designed to dissolve tension rather than confront it. One of the attorneys quickly supported her explanation, adding that digital logging systems and legal custody chains made unauthorized changes nearly impossible without immediate detection, while another insisted that any alert William had received was likely a routine synchronization error between secure servers. The room, sensing the direction of authority, began to relax again, as if reassurance itself had weight that could push reality back into place. Yet Aaliyah did not step back. She looked at William directly, not at the others, as if the conversation happening around her was noise that did not require her participation. William noticed that detail more than anything else, because children who were uncertain usually sought validation from the loudest adult in the room, but she was not doing that. Instead, she was waiting for him specifically, as if the final decision had already been placed in his hands long before he understood it. Evelyn gently touched William's arm again, lowering her voice to remind him that stress before signing major documents often created unnecessary doubt, and that delaying the process could cause complications for the estate planning timeline. William nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the pressure returning to him from every direction except the one place he could not ignore. The phone on the table vibrated once more, a second notification appearing beneath the first, indicating that a restricted file access had been attempted again, this time from an internal account tied to estate administration rather than external intrusion. The timing was too close to be dismissed casually, and William's eyes narrowed as he finally picked up the device, reading the brief system summary without speaking. Evelyn noticed the change in his posture and immediately adjusted her tone, suggesting that modern systems often misinterpreted routine archival activity as unauthorized access, especially during document review periods, and that it would be unwise to let technical alerts interfere with a legally binding decision. The attorneys echoed her sentiment, emphasizing stability, continuity, and the importance of completing the signing process without emotional interruption. But William did not respond immediately, because his attention had shifted fully now to the fact that the system logs were not random. They showed precise access to the very folder Aaliyah had referenced without any prior exposure to its contents. Aaliyah took one small step forward again, her voice steady but quieter, saying that she did not need to see the entire document to know something had been changed, because she had seen Evelyn enter the private study earlier that morning when everyone else was in the East Wing reviewing financial summaries. The room reacted instantly, not with outrage, but with controlled disbelief, as if the idea itself was unacceptable to entertain without proper dismissal. Evelyn's expression did not break, but something in her composure tightened, and she gently shook her head as she stated that she had been in calls all morning and had no reason to enter restricted areas of the house, framing her denial with such calm precision that it felt rehearsed through repetition. William studied both of them in silence, his mind moving between institutional certainty and the strange consistency of what the system was reporting. Outside the glass walls, the afternoon light had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the table, and the estate that once felt controlled now carried a subtle instability, like a structure adjusting itself under unseen pressure. Aaliyah's gaze never left William, and in that stillness, her presence did not feel like interruption, but like alignment with something he had not yet admitted to himself. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the conversation was no longer about procedure but about trust, and trust was the one element no legal framework could fully stabilize once it fractured. William finally lowered his phone, placing it face down on the table with deliberate care, and for the first time since the conversation began, he looked not at Evelyn, not at the attorneys, but at the child who had spoken first. The room waited, not for a decision yet, but for direction, because something in the balance had already begun to tilt away from certainty. The room did not return to normal after William Carter placed his phone face down on the table. Instead, it seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a signal that no one could define. Aaliyah Johnson remained where she was near the doorway, small but steady, her eyes fixed on William as though she was measuring whether he was finally ready to see what she already understood. Evelyn Harper adjusted her posture slightly, maintaining her composed expression, but her attention now shifted more carefully between William and the child, as if recalculating the risk of every word spoken in the room. One of the attorneys cleared his throat and suggested once again that they proceed with the signing process to avoid unnecessary delays, emphasizing that all legal safeguards were in place and that no external concern should interrupt a structured estate transfer. Yet William did not respond immediately, because something in Aaliyah's stillness was beginning to feel less like a child's insistence and more like a sequence of steps leading towards something already in motion. He finally spoke her name, asking her calmly what exactly she meant when she said she had seen something, and Aaliyah did not hesitate, only reached into her small backpack and slowly pulled out a thin portable device no larger than a notebook, its surface slightly scratched as if it had been handled carefully but often. The room shifted again, not loudly, but in subtle reactions, as the attorneys exchanged quick glances and Evelyn's expression tightened just slightly before smoothing back into composure. Aaliyah explained softly that she had found the device earlier near the service corridor outside the study, where she had been sitting for most of the morning while waiting for William to finish his meetings, and that it had been left unattended for a short time before she picked it up out of curiosity. She did not present it as dramatic evidence, only as something she believed belonged to the situation unfolding in front of them. William stepped closer without fully realizing it, his attention narrowing as he looked at the device, noticing it was a secure voice recorder model commonly used for legal documentation and estate meetings. Evelyn immediately stated that many staff members used similar devices for note-keeping and that its presence did not imply anything unusual, but her tone carried a slight urgency now that had not been there before. William asked Aaliyah if she had turned it on, and she nodded, saying quietly that she had only pressed play because she heard voices coming from it when she touched it. The room became still again as William extended his hand, not demanding, but requesting it from her, and Aaliyah carefully placed it into his palm. For a brief moment, no one spoke, and the only sound was the faint hum of the estate's ventilation system moving through the large glass structure. William pressed the playback button. At first, there was only silence, followed by faint ambient noise that suggested a room in use. Then the clear sound of papers being handled, and a voice that made Evelyn's posture shift almost imperceptibly as she recognized the timing of the recording. It captured a conversation that had taken place earlier that morning in the private study, a discussion about document alignment, signature placement, and reference to an updated version of a legal file that should have remained unchanged. The language was careful, not overtly incriminating, but precise enough that the distinction between original and modified documents became unmistakably relevant. William did not interrupt the recording, but his eyes moved slowly from the device to Evelyn, who now placed both hands together in front of her as if maintaining control through stillness alone. The attorneys leaned in slightly, their earlier confidence replaced with cautious attention as the audio continued to reveal procedural references that did not match the official filing timeline. Aaliyah remained silent throughout, watching William rather than the device, as if her purpose had already been fulfilled by simply ensuring the truth could be heard rather than explained. When the recording ended, The silence that followed was heavier than before, because it was no longer uncertain, it was informed. William set the device down carefully on the table, his expression no longer shaped by confusion, but by measured reassessment of everything he had been told since the beginning of the meeting. Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice controlled but noticeably tighter, suggesting that isolated audio clips could be misinterpreted without full context, and that legal processes should not be influenced by incomplete recordings taken out of procedural environment. But William did not immediately respond, because his attention had shifted to the fact that the voices on the recording had referenced document handling that aligned too precisely with the earlier system alerts he had received on his phone. Aaliyah took a small step forward again, not interrupting, only adding softly that she had not understood everything she heard, but she recognized when someone was trying to make something important sound ordinary. That sentence lingered in the space between them longer than anything else, because it was not an accusation, but an observation. William looked at her for a long moment, then slowly turned his gaze toward Evelyn, not with confrontation, but with the beginning of clarity forming where uncertainty had been. The attorneys straightened slightly, sensing the direction of the room shifting away from assumption and toward examination, and for the first time since the signing had begun, William did not reach for the pen or the papers. Instead, he remained still, as if deciding which reality would be allowed to continue forward. The moment the recording ended, the silence in the room did not break, it hardened. William Carter remained standing at the edge of the long mahogany table, his gaze no longer moving between people, but settling into a fixed point that seemed to measure every word that had been spoken since the morning began. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence replaced by careful restraint, as if they had all collectively realized that the structure they depended on was no longer stable in the way they assumed it to be. Evelyn Harper was the first to speak, her voice calm and measured, explaining that even if a recording existed, context mattered, that isolated fragments of conversation could easily be misinterpreted, especially in a household where legal discussions and administrative coordination were constant and overlapping. She emphasized that estate management involved multiple drafts, revisions, and secure transfers that required communication, and that nothing unusual had occurred beyond standard procedure. Her tone was steady, but there was now a subtle tightening around her composure, like a carefully held surface beginning to feel pressure beneath it. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her the way someone looks at a familiar room after noticing a detail that does not belong there, not rejecting it yet, but no longer able to unsee it. Aaliyah Johnson stood near the doorway, still quiet, her small frame unchanged in posture, but her presence now felt less like interruption and more like the point around which everything else was being measured. One of the attorneys stepped forward cautiously, suggesting that if there were concerns about document integrity, they should pause the process entirely and conduct a full audit through proper legal channels, reinforcing that haste would only create confusion in an already sensitive estate transition. Another attorney nodded in agreement, adding that secure systems were designed specifically to prevent unauthorized modifications, implying again that the idea of theft or substitution was unlikely without triggering immediate alerts across multiple verification layers. William slowly turned his head toward them, acknowledging their input, but his attention returned immediately to Evelyn when she spoke again, this time slightly more direct, stating that continuing to entertain accusations without verified proof risked damaging reputations unnecessarily and creating instability within the family structure. The word family lingered briefly in the air, as if it carried weight beyond legal definition. William finally spoke, his voice controlled but lower than before, asking Evelyn directly when she had last entered the private study alone. The question did not carry accusation in its tone, but it carried direction, and the room reacted to it instantly. Evelyn paused for a fraction longer than expected before answering, stating that she had passed through several rooms that morning while coordinating calls and meeting arrangements, but that she had not accessed any restricted materials or altered any documents. Her explanation was careful, structured, and precise, yet William's eyes did not move away from her face as she spoke. Aaliyah took a small step forward at that moment, not interrupting, only adding softly that she had seen Evelyn near the study desk when the hallway was empty, holding what looked like papers before placing them back and closing the door. The statement was simple, without emotion, but it introduced a detail that had not been previously addressed, and the attorneys immediately exchanged quick glances as if recalculating the timeline in their heads. Evelyn turned slightly toward Aaliyah, maintaining her composure, stating that children often misinterpret brief movements and that presence in a hallway did not imply access to confidential material. Her voice remained controlled, but the cadence had changed subtly, becoming more deliberate, as if each word was now being selected with increased caution. William raised one hand slightly, signaling for silence, and for the first time since the discussion began, the entire room complied without hesitation. He asked Aaliyah one question, whether she understood what she had seen or whether she was repeating something she had overheard, and Aaliyah shook her head gently, saying she did not understand legal details, but she understood when someone entered a room carefully and left it differently than before. That sentence created another shift, not dramatic, but structural, because it moved the discussion away from technical explanation and toward observation of behavior. One of the attorneys cleared his throat again, attempting to re-establish procedural order, suggesting that all claims should be documented formally and reviewed by an independent trustee before any conclusions were drawn. But William did not look at him. Instead, he stepped slightly away from the table, placing distance between himself and the documents that had been the center of the meeting. Evelyn followed his movement. With her eyes, and for the first time her composure showed a slight fracture in timing, a delay in response that suggested recalculation rather than confidence. William asked her quietly if she would object to a full review of all digital access logs and physical entry records for the estate study over the past 48 hours. The question was not loud, but it carried finality in its structure. Evelyn hesitated just long enough for the room to notice, then stated that she had no objection to transparency, but reiterated that she was confident nothing improper would be found. Aaliyah remained still, watching William rather than the exchange, as if the outcome had already begun forming in his decision before anyone else spoke. The attorneys began to move toward administrative language again, discussing audit procedures and verification timelines, but the energy in the room had changed irreversibly. William finally turned his full attention toward the center of the table where the original documents lay, untouched since the recording had played, and said quietly that no further signing would take place until every version of every document had been accounted for in full. The statement was simple, but it ended the motion of the room entirely, leaving only stillness where certainty had been expected, and in that stillness, Aaliyah Johnson did not look surprised, only confirmed. The decision to halt the signing process did not create chaos, but a controlled silence that spread through the Carter estate like a shift in atmospheric pressure. William Carter remained standing away from the table, his posture steady but no longer aligned with the structure of the meeting, as if he had stepped slightly outside the role he had been occupying all morning. The attorneys exchanged quiet remarks about procedure, suggesting formal suspension of the session, while one of them began organizing documents with careful, deliberate movements that tried to preserve professionalism despite the uncertainty now surrounding the estate process. Evelyn Harper did not speak immediately. She stood near the head of the table, hands relaxed at her sides, her expression composed but increasingly measured, as if recalibrating each reaction in real time. Aaliyah Johnson remained near the doorway, still and observant, her attention fixed on William rather than the legal conversation unfolding around him, as though the outcome mattered less than whether he had truly heard what she had been trying to show him from the beginning. William finally turned slightly toward the group and stated that until every version of the document was verified, no further action would be taken, and that all digital access records, physical movement logs, and authorized entry histories connected to the estate study would need to be reviewed in full detail. The instruction was calm, but it carried authority that immediately redirected the energy in the room. One of the attorneys acknowledged the request and stepped aside to begin initiating formal audit procedures, while another quietly contacted administrative support to prepare secure retrieval protocols for archived records. Evelyn finally spoke, her tone still controlled, stating that she supported transparency and had no objection to any review process, reiterating that she had nothing to conceal and that clarity would ultimately confirm what she already knew to be true. William listened without interruption, his focus shifting between her and the documents on the table. But now his attention was no longer anchored in trust or assumption, only in verification. Aaliyah took a small step forward, not to interrupt, but to ensure she was seen, and said softly that the second time she noticed Evelyn near the study, the door had been closed more carefully than before, as if someone wanted to make sure no one would notice how briefly it had been opened. The detail was small, almost insignificant on its own, but it added a layer to the timeline that the attorneys immediately began mentally reconstructing. Evelyn turned her head slightly toward Aaliyah, her expression unchanged, and stated again that children often interpret routine movement as significance when they are not aware of the context behind it, maintaining her position with calm consistency. But William raised his hand once more, signaling for silence, and this time the room obeyed instantly, without hesitation. He asked for confirmation of the exact timing of the recorded system alerts on his phone compared to the estate study access logs, and one of the attorneys confirmed after a brief review that both events had occurred within minutes of each other earlier that morning. That synchronization shifted the conversation from speculation into alignment of independent data points, and the room grew quieter again, not from confusion, but from recognition that patterns were beginning to form. Evelyn exhaled slowly, maintaining her composure, and suggested that parallel system activity was not unusual in large estates with multiple authorized users, emphasizing again that interpretation should not replace verification. William nodded slightly, but did not respond verbally, instead walking slowly toward the window where the city skyline stretched beyond the glass, bright and indifferent to the tension inside. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence behind him became more structured than before, as if everyone was waiting for a conclusion that had not yet been spoken. Aaliyah remained in the same position, her small presence steady, and her eyes followed William as he turned back toward the table. He looked at the documents again, then at Evelyn, then at the attorneys, and finally stated that until full verification was completed, all estate-related authority over the contested documents would be temporarily suspended. The statement did not carry accusation, only control over process, but its effect was immediate. Evelyn's expression remained composed, yet her fingers tightened briefly before relaxing again, a small motion that did not escape William's attention. The attorneys acknowledged the directive and began preparing formal documentation to reflect the suspension. Aaliyah did not move, did not speak, only observed as the structure of authority in the room subtly reorganized itself around a single decision. William returned to the table slowly, placing one hand on its surface, not to resume signing, but to steady the moment as it transitioned into something else entirely, while the city outside continued. Unchanged, unaware that inside the Carter estate, the definition of control had just begun to shift. The suspension of all estate authority over the contested documents did not create resolution, but rather opened a quieter and more unsettling phase inside the Carter estate, where every movement now carried the weight of being observed and interpreted. William Carter remained near the table, one hand resting on its polished surface as if anchoring himself to something physically certain, while the internal structure of trust around him continued to shift. The attorneys had already begun transitioning from discussion to formal documentation, preparing notices of procedural halt and initiating internal audit requests through secure estate channels, their voices lower now, more measured, as if they were working inside a system that required extreme precision to avoid further disruption. Evelyn Harper stood slightly apart from the group, maintaining her composed posture, but her silence now felt more intentional, as if she was waiting for the next logical step rather than reacting to the current one. Aaliyah Johnson remained near the doorway, her small presence unchanged, but her attention never left William, as though she understood that the real decision was no longer about documents, but about what he was willing to believe moving forward. William finally broke the silence by instructing that all physical access records for the private study, including staff movement logs and digital entry authorizations from the past 72 hours, be compiled immediately and cross-referenced with system alerts. One of the attorneys acknowledged the request and moved toward a secure terminal in the adjacent section of the room, while another began organizing a formal request for IT verification support from the estate's cybersecurity division. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, not toward tension, but toward methodical examination, as if everyone had accepted that the situation was no longer hypothetical and required structured investigation. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm but precise, stating that she welcomed any review that would confirm the integrity of the estate processes, and that she remained confident all actions taken within the household had been transparent and properly authorized. William did not respond immediately, instead reviewing the timeline in his mind, aligning the system notifications, the recording, and Aaliyah's observations into a single sequence that now refused to separate cleanly into coincidence. Aaliyah stepped forward slightly, her voice still soft but steady, adding that she had seen someone exit the study quickly earlier that morning, carrying nothing visible, but moving with enough awareness to avoid being noticed by staff in the corridor. The attorneys paused briefly at that detail, exchanging glances as they began to mentally reconstruct possible movement paths through the estate's interior layout. Evelyn turned her head toward Aaliyah, her expression still composed, and repeated that no unauthorized access had occurred under her awareness, emphasizing that the estate operated under strict protocols that would have flagged any breach immediately. But William raised his hand again, not in interruption, but in control of direction, and asked for confirmation of whether any secondary override access had been granted during scheduled maintenance windows. The question shifted the focus immediately, and one of the attorneys responded after checking preliminary logs that a temporary administrative override had been authorized earlier that morning for system calibration purposes, though it should not have granted access to restricted legal files. That clarification introduced a new layer into the sequence, and William's expression tightened slightly as he recognized that procedural exceptions, even when legitimate, could create unintended exposure points within secure systems. Evelyn stated calmly that maintenance access was standard procedure and fully documented, and that any overlap with legal file visibility would be a system design flaw rather than intentional action. William nodded once, absorbing the explanation, but did not accept it as conclusion, instead treating it as another variable requiring verification. Aaliyah did not speak again, but her presence remained steady, and for the first time William noticed that she was not reacting emotionally to the unfolding situation, but observing it with consistency, as if tracking patterns rather than events. The attorneys began discussing immediate technical audits, suggesting forensic review of server logs, access point tracking, and authentication pathways to determine exactly how the document variation had been introduced. Evelyn listened without interruption, her hands now loosely clasped, her composure intact but increasingly contained, like a surface holding steady while underlying pressure redistributed. William finally stepped away from the table entirely, walking slowly toward the glass wall overlooking the city, where traffic continued its steady movement far below, indifferent to the structured collapse of certainty occurring inside the estate. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the room behind him remained quiet, waiting not for emotion, but for instruction. Then he turned slightly, not toward the attorneys, not toward Evelyn, but toward Aaliyah, and asked in a calm voice if she was certain about what she had seen, not in detail, but in pattern. Aaliyah simply nodded once, without hesitation or embellishment. That single confirmation settled differently than all previous statements, because it was not shaped by defense, procedure, or interpretation. It stood alone. William returned his gaze toward the center of the room and stated that the audit would proceed immediately at full depth, including all digital, physical, and administrative access layers without exception, and that no further assumptions would be made until results were complete. The attorneys acknowledged the directive and began moving with increased urgency toward execution. Evelyn remained still, her expression unchanged, but now entirely unreadable. Aaliyah stepped back slightly toward the doorway again, returning to her original position, while William stood between the table and the window, no longer part of the signing process, but fully inside the investigation that had replaced it. The audit process began without delay, transforming the atmosphere inside the Carter estate from a tense meeting room into a structured investigation environment where every action now had to be documented and verified. William Carter remained near the glass wall for a moment longer, watching the city outside, as if searching for a sense of normal rhythm that no longer matched what was happening behind him. Then he turned back toward the room, rejoining the center of activity where the attorneys had already divided responsibilities, one team focusing on digital access logs, another on physical movement records, and a third preparing a full timeline reconstruction of all interactions connected to the private study. Evelyn Harper stood near the edge of the table, still composed, her posture unchanged, but her attention now clearly fixed on the procedural flow unfolding around her. Aaliyah Johnson remained near the doorway, quiet and observant, her presence steady as she watched William coordinate the investigation rather than the attorneys who were executing it. One of the estate technicians arrived within minutes, carrying a secure terminal used for high-level administrative audits, and immediately began synchronizing system logs from multiple access points across the estate network. The room filled with low technical confirmations as encrypted records were decrypted and aligned into a unified timeline. William stepped closer to the monitor as entries began to populate the screen, showing precise timestamps of entry authorizations, corridor movement data, and restricted system access attempts tied to the private study. At first, everything appeared consistent with standard administrative activity, but as the timeline extended, subtle inconsistencies began to appear in the sequence of access confirmations. One entry in particular showed a brief, unauthorized authentication overlap occurring during the same window that Aaliyah had described earlier, a moment when the study door had been closed, but system activity indicated internal file interaction. The technician paused, double-checking the integrity of the log signature, while one of the attorneys leaned in to verify the timestamp alignment. Evelyn's gaze shifted toward the monitor for the first time with visible focus, though her expression remained controlled, as if evaluating the interpretation rather than reacting to the data itself. William asked for clarification on whether the system could differentiate between authorized staff presence and direct file access within the same authenticated session, and the technician confirmed that while general entry could be shared across multiple users, sensitive legal files required separate layered verification that should not have been bypassed under normal conditions. That distinction changed the tone of the room again, not through accusation, but through narrowing probability. Aaliyah stepped slightly forward from the doorway, her voice soft but steady as she repeated that she had seen Evelyn near the study during the same time window marked on the log, not entering loudly or visibly, but moving with deliberate caution before the door closed. The attorneys now focused entirely on the timeline, expanding the audit range to include secondary system triggers such as motion sensors, door pressure logs, and ambient access detection used in restricted areas of the estate. As the data compiled, a second anomaly appeared, indicating that the study door had been opened briefly using a maintenance override sequence rather than a standard authorized keycard entry. William's expression tightened slightly as he absorbed this detail, recognizing that maintenance protocols had already been referenced earlier but not fully correlated with physical access points. Evelyn spoke calmly, reiterating that maintenance operations were conducted regularly and often involved overlapping system access for efficiency, emphasizing again that no intentional breach had occurred and that any irregularity must be attributed to system design limitations rather than personal action. The technician confirmed that maintenance overrides did exist, but were supposed to be isolated from legal document directories, and that the current overlap required deeper forensic review to determine how routing permissions had been temporarily extended. The room fell into structured silence again as the implications of the data began to settle. William stepped back from the monitor, processing the alignment of all information presented so far, the recording, the system alerts, Aaliyah's observations, and now the access log inconsistencies forming a continuous chain rather than separate events. He asked the team to reconstruct the exact physical movement path within the estate during the critical time window, mapping corridor usage, door access, and staff presence. The attorneys complied, overlaying architectural layouts with time-stamped movement data, creating a visual sequence of activity that began to narrow the possibilities of who had been present in the study and when. Evelyn remained still, her composure unchanged, but her focus now fully engaged with the reconstruction process unfolding on the screen. Aaliyah returned to her quiet position near the doorway, no longer adding new information, only observing as the system began to confirm the structure of what she had described earlier. William watched the reconstruction complete itself, seeing patterns emerge not through speculation, but through synchronized data points aligning across independent systems. After a long pause, he stated calmly that the investigation would continue until every overlapping access point was fully explained and verified, including maintenance sequences, staff movement, and document revision history. The attorneys acknowledged the directive and expanded the audit scope further, while Evelyn gave a small nod, still composed, but now entirely within the framework of scrutiny. Aaliyah remained silent, her gaze steady, as the estate that had once been defined by certainty continued transforming into a space where only verified truth could remain. The estate had fallen into a new kind of silence, one that was no longer shaped by uncertainty, but by accumulation, as each new layer of data confirmed that the investigation was no longer exploring possibility, but tracing an actual sequence of events. William Carter stood beside the central monitor, his attention fixed on the reconstructed timeline now displayed across multiple synchronized screens, each showing movement paths, access logs, and authentication traces aligned to the same critical time window. The attorneys had expanded the audit scope further, pulling in backup archives from the estate's secondary servers, while the technical team cross-referenced maintenance override protocols with restricted file access permissions. Evelyn Harper remained in the same position near the table, her posture unchanged, but her focus was now fully integrated into the unfolding verification process, watching the timeline as it evolved rather than the discussion around it. Aaliyah Johnson stood near the doorway, still quiet, her small presence unchanged, yet her attention remained steady on William, as if she was observing not the data itself, but his reaction to its formation. One of the technicians highlighted a newly isolated anomaly on the screen, indicating a brief but precise alignment between a maintenance override window and direct access to the private studies document registry. The timestamp matched earlier alerts, confirming that the system had registered a layered access sequence that should not have been possible under normal operational segmentation. William leaned slightly forward, asking whether the override sequence had been initiated from within the estate or externally authorized, and the technician responded that the signature originated from an internal administrative terminal located in the West Wing service corridor. That detail immediately narrowed the physical scope of investigation, prompting the attorneys to map staff movement logs against corridor access data in real time. Evelyn spoke calmly, stating again that maintenance systems were routinely used across multiple zones of the estate and that overlapping administrative functions could create false intersections in the log structure, emphasizing that interpretation required caution before drawing conclusions. But William did not respond immediately, instead focusing on the visual reconstruction forming on the screen, where movement paths were now represented as layered trajectories across the estate layout. Aaliyah stepped slightly forward again, her voice soft but precise, adding that she had seen someone exit the West Wing corridor shortly after the time the system registered the override activity, moving quickly but not appearing rushed, as if they were confident no one would notice the timing. The technicians paused at that statement, cross-checking corridor sensor data, which confirmed a brief passage event that aligned with the same time frame. The attorneys grew more focused, adjusting filters to isolate identity tags associated with that movement sequence, while William maintained a steady silence, absorbing the convergence of physical and digital confirmation points. Evelyn's expression remained composed, but her eyes now followed the movement reconstruction more closely, as if anticipating the direction of the analysis rather than reacting to it. The screen updated again, this time revealing a consolidated pathway showing that a single authenticated session had passed through both maintenance override access and restricted document directories within a compressed interval that should have triggered automatic system segmentation alerts. One of the technicians stated carefully that such a sequence would require either simultaneous credential layering or intentional internal authorization restructuring, both of which would leave distinct administrative traces requiring further validation. William asked whether any such restructuring had been logged, and the response was that no formal authorization existed within the visible administrative records. The room did not react outwardly, but the weight of that confirmation settled into a deeper level of scrutiny. Evelyn finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, stating that the absence of formal restructuring documentation did not automatically imply wrongdoing, and that technical systems occasionally created synchronization errors during high-volume administrative periods. William nodded once, but his attention remained fixed on the alignment of movement data and system access, where the overlap between physical presence and digital authorization was now too precise to dismiss casually. Aaliyah remained still, no longer adding new observations, but her earlier statements continued to integrate into the verified structure forming on the screen. The attorneys adjusted the timeline again, refining the sequence into a narrow window where all confirmed events intersected, reducing the estate's complex activity into a single corridor of possibility. William stepped back slightly from the monitor, his expression controlled but fully engaged, and instructed that all remaining unexplained access points within that window be identified and traced to their origin, regardless of administrative level or system hierarchy. The technicians acknowledged immediately and expanded the forensic scope further into deeper server logs and auxiliary authentication records. Evelyn gave a small, measured nod, remaining composed within the structure of investigation, while Aaliyah returned to her original position near the doorway, watching as the system continued to converge toward a conclusion that had not yet been spoken aloud but was already forming within the data itself. The final phase of the audit did not arrive with dramatic revelation, but with a gradual tightening of all previously scattered data points until they converged into a single coherent sequence that could no longer be interpreted as coincidence. William Carter stood at the center of the monitoring display, his eyes fixed on the consolidated timeline now reconstructed across multiple estate systems, where every access event, corridor movement, and administrative override had been aligned into one continuous narrative. The technicians had completed cross-referencing all available logs, including backup server archives and secondary authentication records, reducing the estate's complex operational activity into a precise interval that matched the earlier anomaly window. One of the attorneys spoke carefully, confirming that all physical access points to the private study during that window had been accounted for, except for a single overlapping administrative session that connected maintenance authorization with restricted document visibility. That statement lingered in the room, not as speculation, but as a verified structural gap in the access hierarchy. Evelyn Harper remained composed near the table, her posture unchanged, but her attention was now fully directed toward the screen, where the final reconstruction was being displayed in real time. Aaliyah Johnson stood near the doorway, still and quiet, her presence unchanged, yet her gaze remained fixed on William, as if she was observing not the data but the moment it began to settle into understanding. The technician highlighted the final correlation point, showing that the maintenance override had been initiated from within the estate, but the administrative session that followed it had directly interacted with the legal document registry in a way that bypassed standard segmentation protocols. William asked for confirmation one final time, his voice controlled but firm, whether any external breach or third-party intrusion had been detected at any stage of the sequence, and the technician confirmed that all access originated internally, with no external infiltration recorded. That confirmation shifted the room into absolute silence, because it removed ambiguity from the structure of events and left only internal accountability. Evelyn finally spoke, her tone still calm, but now carrying a measured rigidity, stating that internal system overlaps were a known limitation in complex estate environments, and that procedural irregularities did not automatically equate to intentional modification of legal documents. William did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the timeline again, focusing on the precise intersection where physical movement, administrative override, and document registry access had converged within the same compressed timeframe. Aaliyah stepped forward slightly, her voice soft but steady, repeating that she had seen the same person near the study during that exact window, moving with deliberate control and leaving the corridor before the system registered the final access confirmation. The attorneys remained silent, no longer debating interpretation. only verifying alignment between recorded movement and system output. One of them quietly stated that the convergence of all three independent verification layers, physical logs, digital authentication, and maintenance records, now formed a single uninterrupted chain that required formal classification review under estate integrity protocols. William slowly turned away from the screen and looked toward the center of the room, his expression no longer searching but settling into clarity, shaped by verification rather than assumption. Evelyn maintained her composure, but the absence of immediate rebuttal from the technical side of the room created a silence that carried more weight than any spoken denial. Aaliyah returned to her position near the doorway, no longer adding new observations, only watching as the conclusion began forming without being explicitly declared. William finally stated in a calm, controlled voice that all findings would be formally documented and submitted for independent legal verification, and that no estate authority regarding the contested documents would be reinstated until external review confirmed full procedural integrity. The attorneys acknowledged the directive and began initiating formal reporting channels, while the technicians secured all reconstructed data for archival review. Evelyn gave a small nod, still composed, but now fully within the boundaries of formal investigation rather than internal assumption. The room did not react further, because there was nothing left to interpret in fragments. Aaliyah remained still as William stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the completed timeline on the screen, where every movement, every access, and every anomaly had finally aligned into a single undeniable structure that no longer required explanation, only recognition.